Hey, folks. So, today we're going to be talking about the different ways of knowing. So, how do we come to believe that something's true? And how do we come to believe that something might be real or might be false? So, some of the things we're going to be talking about today were initially developed by an American chemist named Charles Sanders Peirce. And the list that we have here isn't the original list that Pierce had, but it's sort of what's grown out of that tradition. So it's lots of different ways that we could come to believe that something's true. And we'll look at what we do when we're talking about science. So let's start out with the method of tenacity. So when we believe something by the method of tenacity, we are believing that a thing is true because we've heard it over and over again, or because it is something we just haven't had any reason to reject, right? So if we think about lots of stuff that could be common sense, it could be folk wisdom, it could be things that you were explicitly told, or things that are sort of implicit within your culture, ideas that have been around for a long time. But just because an idea's been around for a long time, just because it's been a part of common sense, doesn't mean that it's necessarily true. So, for example, you've probably heard before, wait 30 minutes after you've eaten before swimming, right? That's a really common part of common sense, but it's not true, right? You're not going to get stomach cramps just because you go swimming 25 minutes after you had a sandwich. This can also be cultural beliefs, right? So, what does your culture say about gender roles? Or what does your culture say about the importance of wealth versus the importance of leading a fulfilling life? Think about something as simple as high heels, right? Most of us probably assume that high heels are an article of women's clothing. Now, we might think that it's okay for a guy to wear high heels, but what they're doing is they're wearing women's clothing. That wasn't always the case. So, back in the 1700s, for example, it was men who wore high heels. So, these things that we kind of take for granted in our culture and believe, well, that must have been the way it has always been, that must be the way it is for everybody. That's often not the case. Even something as simple as this color being green and this color being blue. Now, that might seem obvious, right? We don't need to sit around and spend years and years proving that this is green and this is blue. But that's not the way it is in every language, right? Some languages, like don't I want to say Japanese, doesn't make a distinction between green and blue. It's all just different shades of the same single color. So some of the things that we believe, we don't necessarily have a reason to believe them. It's just sort of the way that it's always been, and we don't see a reason to go against it. Now, the method of intuition is relying on gut feelings and relying on your emotional intuitions. Malcolm Gladwell wrote a whole book about this called Blink, and I'm sure that some of us have seen some version of you should always trust your gut, right? Your gut's always going to be correct. Well, not really, right? So Stephen Colbert kind of lampooned this a lot in his show, The Colbert Report, right? He called it truthiness, and he sarcastically would say things like, when you feel it in your gut, you know it must be right, even if it's going against all the facts, right? So he's not being sincere there. He's kind of satirizing this over reliance on intuition. Some of the problems with intuition, it's guided by our prejudices. So when we rely on our intuition, often what we're relying on is the things that we already believe, things that we already think are true. So when we come up with something that we think is an insight through intuition, often what we're really doing is just falling back on our old prejudices or our old preconceived notions. Intuition is good. There are going to be some times where relying on intuition might be quicker than having to sit around and think about it deliberately. And that's great in a moment to moment situation where time matters. But your intuitions are only going to be as good as the knowledge that you've acquired and the experience that you've acquired. Just because you came to something through intuition doesn't mean it's correct. Now, what about relying on authority? There are going to be some times where we might not want to just trust our gut, or we might not want to go out and see it for ourselves. For example, people tell me that you can't breathe in space. I don't feel any compunction to try to go out in space in a spacesuit and take off my helmet and see if I can breathe it in order to believe that. I'm going to trust the experts on that one. Think about our current situation with coronavirus, right? You could believe an expert like Anthony Fauci, or you could believe your aunt's third husband on Facebook who says that nobody needs to wear a mask and nobody needs to wash their hands, right? If I got to make a choice between Dr. Fauci and my aunt's third husband, I'm going to go with the Fauci. But just because somebody's an authority doesn't mean that they're always going to be correct. Sometimes an authority might be lying to you. This guy right here is Andrew Wakefield. He was an MD who was the first one to make the claim that vaccines, specifically the MMR vaccine, cause autism. And the paper in which he supposedly proved this relationship turned out he just made up the data, right? He was actively lying when he wrote that paper. So there's no link between MMR and being on the autism spectrum, right? There's no link between the vaccine and later on developing symptoms of autism. But it was just something that this person said, and because he was an expert, a lot of people believed him. Now, later on, he was discredited, but the damage had already been done. And sometimes an expert's knowledge might be out of date. They might not be trying to lie to you, but they could be relying on a finding that is not the most recent idea, or maybe later on something comes along that disproves them. So, for example, Daniel Kahneman, very influential psychologist, he won the Nobel Prize for Economics in the early 2000s, has a wonderful book called Thinking Fast and Slow, where he talks about our intuitions and using willpower. And in the book, he claims that one of the ways that you can do if you're feeling sluggish and you need to have more willpower is to eat glucose, right? Eat sugar, and that should restore your willpower. And when he said that, there were some initial studies that substantiated that claim. Since then, though, the more research has been done, it seems like that's not really the case, right? The first few findings were just kind of a fluke, and people have a hard time replicating that initial finding. So just because an expert said it once doesn't mean that their opinion is still up to date. That's why there's so much of a focus on finding the most recent scientific papers in psychology or any other field. And sometimes experts just make mistakes. Last semester, when I was teaching Intro to Psychology, I told my students that Margaret Floy Washburn invented a technique to treat phobias called counter conditioning. And I didn't realize until later on that day, oh, I goofed, right? It's Mary Cover Jones, not Margaret Floy Washburn. And maybe you can see my mistake here. They both have, known by three names. Their first names both start with an M. But, I goofed it. Hey, just because I might be an expert in psychology doesn't mean I'm going to get it right 100% of the time. So even if somebody's being sincere, even if somebody's up to date on their knowledge, they could sometimes just beef it, right? So you can't rely on an expert all the time. And what we see a lot of, especially on the internet, is somebody who's an expert in one field trying to claim expertise in another field. So over here we have Steven Pinker, over here we have Jordan Peterson. Steven Pinker is a very accomplished psychologist in the field of psycholinguistics. That's the psychology of language. Jordan Peterson is very accomplished in the field of personality psychology. Both of these guys, though, love to spout off their opinions about politics. Pinker tends to be a little bit more liberal. Peterson tends to be a little bit more conservative. But the thing we have to keep in mind, just because you have doctor or professor in front of your name, doesn't mean you're an expert in everything. You might be an expert in your particular field in psychology, but that doesn't even make you an expert in all fields of psychology, let alone an expert in things that are sort of outside of your realm, like medicine or politics. So another method we might use is rationalism, right? Relying on logic, in other words. So you might say to yourself, did Socrates have two hands? And the way that we would address that is with something called a logistical statement, right? Some logical reasoning. So you've got a premise. Socrates was a man, and you got another premise. All men have two hands. Therefore, Socrates must have had two hands. Well, that is all well and good. That is, technically speaking, a sound logical argument. You've got one premise, you've got another premise, and you got a conclusion that says if both of these premises are true, then this conclusion must be true. The problem is, not all men have two hands, right? Some people might have a congenital abnormality that results in them not having two hands. Some people might have lost one or both hands through trauma or disease. So we might say all men have two hands. Socrates was a man. Therefore, Socrates had two hands. But our premise is flawed, right? In other words, our understanding of the world is flawed. And rationalism is only as good as your knowledge. right? If your knowledge is inaccurate, if the premises that you're reasoning from are inaccurate, then your conclusions are going to be inaccurate if all you're relying on is knowledge itself. So something else you could try is empiricism. So empiricism here is not related to the political notion of empire. It comes from the word empirical, which means relying on your senses. So rather than just trusting my gut or listening to an authority or reasoning from some potentially flawed logic, I could just go out and discover it for myself. This is what people mean when they say seeing is believing. All right, I'm not going to believe it until I can see it, touch it, taste it, feel it for myself. And that's all well and good. Now, sometimes you hear people say empiricism as if it's interchangeable with science. We're going to see in a moment why that's not the case. But there is some empiricism in science, right? Some relying on direct observation. But direct observation alone is not always going to get you to the truth. For one, not everybody has the exact same experience for a given stimulus, right? Now, some of you might like cilantro, some of you might not like cilantro. Part of that's genetic. Some people have a gene that makes cilantro taste like soap, or it might be due to biological factors like age. There's certain frequencies that older people can't hear, but but younger people can hear. So if you have this gene that makes cilantro taste like soap, you might taste the cilantro and you might think, oh, this is terrible. Nobody must like cilantro, right? And people who must like cilantro have to be out of their minds because this thing tastes like soap. But you're having a different experience than what the other person is having. And there's some phenomena that are just hard to detect using our unaided systems, right? Like ultraviolet light or atoms. These are things that you can't just look at with your naked eye and see. So we're a bit limited by our sensory capacities of our human bodies. We're also limited by the processing power of our human brains. So they're not perfect perceivers of reality, our brains. You can see this often with optical illusions and mirages. Take a look at this picture here. If you look at it long enough, you'll start to see some movement here. Maybe you see that this part's moving or the background is moving, but it's a completely static picture. It's not an animated picture. It's just an optical illusion. And even though if you know it's an illusion, I know it's an illusion, I look at it and it still starts looking like it's moving to me. Or if you've ever driven down a road on a hot sunny day and seen what looks like a big puddle of water, but the closer you get to it, you start not seeing the water anymore, right? But then you see more water farther down the road. That's an optical illusion, right? And I might know that's not water, but it sure as heck looks like water to me, right? So relying on empiricism alone might not always get you there. Now, it's important to keep in mind most people and most schools of thought and most traditions don't rely on just one of these methods, right? There's usually some combination at play, right? All of us use tenacity and authority and intuition and rationalism and empiricism, right? There's probably nobody who doesn't use all five of those things at some point in their lives, but there's some traditions who put more emphasis on some of these ways of knowing than others. So, for example, some Christian intellectual traditions might rely on authority and rationalism, right? We have this authority, whether that is the Bible or the Catechism or whatever are the canonical texts in your particular brand of Christianity. And then we try to use our rationalism to understand what that means, right? So, what did the original author of the book of Acts mean here, right? What does it mean in the original Greek? Where you go back to the Old Testament, what does it mean in the original Hebrew? What were they trying to get across? There might be some spiritual traditions, like some forms of Buddhism, where you might focus more on authority and intuition. So maybe there is a teacher who is giving you certain insights, and then you're expected to come to the rest on your own through intuitions about the way the world works. Now, in science, we primarily use rationalism and empiricism. So, rationalism, we take what we know about the world to make predictions about what's going to happen with a phenomenon or make predictions about things we don't know about, but we don't stop there, right? We don't just stop with rationalism. We also use empiricism to go out and do some systematic observations. So we use rationalism to make predictions and empiricism to test those predictions. That's going to be important coming up later this week when we talk about ancient philosophers, right? So the Romans, the Greeks, medieval philosophers, they were using rationalism primarily, not a lot of empiricism, and that means that they were limited in their conclusions based on what they knew about the world around them at the time, right? They can only come to conclusions that were as solid as their understanding of the world. And we'll see how that begins to change in the Renaissance and the modern era as more focus starts to get put on empiricism. Okay, so that's where we're gonna leave off for right now. When we come back, we'll talk about some of the persistent questions in psychology, and these are persistent questions in philosophy as well. So we'll talk about that next time. See you then.